I'm your host, Dr. Sean Blicky, and in today's episode, we're discussing evidence for the resurrection of Christ. Now, joining me today is our co-host, Dr. Alexandra Burnett. She's the Director of Teaching Excellence. Welcome, Dr. Burnett.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I'm excited about today's episode.
Well, today we're talking about the topic of the resurrection of Christ. We have with us an expert on the topic, Dr. Gary Habermas. And not just any expert, but one of the world's leading experts on this subject. Dr. Habermas is a distinguished research professor at Liberty University. He's the author of more than 50 books, over 75 chapters, over 100 scholarly articles. He's delivered more than 2,000 lectures at more than 100 universities, churches, and seminars across the globe. Welcome to In Pursuit of Excellence, Dr. Habermas.
Thank you very much. It's a fantastic topic, and I'm glad to be with you.
Well, Dr. Habermas, your last book is called On the Resurrection, Evidences. And I understand it's the first volume of several that represents a culmination of more than 50 years of your research on the probability of Christ's resurrection. And now I have to admit something. Normally when I interview a guest who's an author, I first read their book. But in this case, when I went to buy it, it was already sold out.
It is.
That's a remarkable start for any author or any book, let alone one on a topic that's 2,000 years old. But so how did that happen?
Well, it's all a long story. You mentioned 50 books. About almost half of my books are on the resurrection. You go, well, how many times do you have to say it? Well, a number of the books are brief, but they're debates. Debated Anthony Flew, the best-known philosophical atheist in the world. We debated 3 times. All 3 of them are books. So, but this last set of 4 books has no repeat. From at least the first 3 volumes have maybe reproduced stuff from maybe 100 pages. But these books are 1,000 pages each. So my first 3 volumes, the first one that came out printed is just under 1,100 pages. Manuscript was like 1,300. So volumes 2 and 3 are at the publishers. I'm working on 4 right now. So there's a lot to say about the subject.
Yeah, great. Well, even if I had a copy, I'm not sure I'd be able to get through all of it before today's interview, given its size. I know 1,100 pages is probably a lot.
Oh, you wouldn't
write.
have to read 1,100. It's only 1072.
Okay. So, well, I know seeing the size of the book is something else.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if it needs its own bookcase, but if the sellers give you free shipping, they'll probably lose money on that one. But I know you've written a lot of things in apologetics, but what inspired you to sit down and write something of this size and scope this time on the resurrection?
A lot of people say, why'd you start on the resurrection? Let me guess. You're very altruistic and you try to help people with doubts. And I went, no. I tried to help me with doubts. And so that's what got me into it, because I realized early on that if Jesus was really raised from the dead, that alone could bear the weight of Christianity. This latest one is because I'd already done these 23 or whatever, half of my books at that time were on the resurrection. And one of my best students, a Liberty grad, who also published his dissertation on the resurrection, he said, you have got to stop and write everything you know on this. And I said, Mike, in all fairness, I don't have 10 years to walk away from everything and do this. No, you got to. And then he stunned me with a sentence. He said, you don't want this material to die with you. And I thought, oh my gosh, I don't think I'm close to dying. Now, it was 10 years ago. I'm 10 years closer now. I said, I don't want this material to die with me, but you know what? I cannot ignore what you're saying. If my main point here is ministry, that is why these books were written. I'm trying to say things that will hopefully change people's hearts and minds. Let me make one statement. A good friend of mine who's a fellow apologist, when he goes to state universities, his name's Greg Kokel. He says, I'm not trying to convert you guys. I'm trying to put a stone in your shoe. And if all I do is put some stones in shoes and make people think about things, I'll think the book has served its purpose.
Yeah, that's actually a good transition, Dr. Burnett.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we get too much into the book, one of the things that you use for your argument is the minimal facts argument. Can you explain what that is or define it for us?
Yeah, it's what really got me started and what I'm generally known for, because that's what happened with my doctoral dissertation. I did my PhD at Michigan State University, and I submitted another topic for my dissertation topic, and the committee listened, and they go, oh, you really have to hone this thing, which is what I say to students now. You got to hone that topic more. And instead of honing it, I went back and I said, I've done a lot of research on the resurrection. Why don't I just put it out there and see what they say? So I came to the second meeting, proposed resurrection. They accepted it with no honing. And the head of my program, who did not believe in the resurrection, in those days, more than 3 people are on a committee. I had 6 people on my committee, and 3 were yes on the resurrection and 3 were no. The historian representing the historian department was a non-Christian Jewish historian. He's the most complimentary guy on my committee, so it was really, really neat. But the head of my program said to me, we're liberal compared to what your background is. They knew my background. And they said, but we're good liberal. I go, what's good liberal? He said, when you write your dissertation on the resurrection, we don't have to agree with you. If you can defend it, you get it. I said, that's fair enough. But then he said, here's the follow-up point. Don't say it happened because the Bible said it happened. I said, how long's it got to be? He said, it should be at least 200 pages. And I said, would you take 180? He goes, 180. We can't do any less than that. The book turned out to be 350 pages long, the dissertation.
Wow.
And that's when I developed this method, because these guys were critics. Yeah. So you can't say something's true because the Bible says it's true. So here's where I misunderstood him. I can use the New Testament all I want. Just have backup for every single verse I use. You have to have additional reasons. So I came up with a list of 6 facts, which virtually everybody allows, and I gave evidences for each one. That's why the book is so long. And I averaged 14.7 reasons per fact. That's how it started. I used 12 facts. I shrunk the list to 6 that we're really sure about, and those 6 were the minimal facts. So it's the things that even an atheist New Testament scholar would say happened.
Wow, that's excellent. Thank you. So I know in your book you list many historical minimal facts, so we can get into some of the facts more in depth later, but for our listeners, can you quickly just list some of the historical minimal facts for us?
Yeah, I just told my PhD class 3 sets of 2 each, 6. Jesus died on the cross, and his followers, everyone admits this, his followers had experiences which they believed were appearances of the risen Jesus. I go, oh, as long as you add they believe, yeah, we're good with that. And even the atheists admit that. Then 3rd and 4th, these events were proclaimed very, very early. Now, when Christians say that, they often think you mean the canonical books. John's the furthest away at plus 65, Mark's the closest at plus 30 to 40. But the sources we use are from the 30s AD. We actually have sources from the 30s AD, and there's plenty of them because they established these minimal facts. So I kept backing up till we got it earlier and earlier and earlier, and that's why nobody disputes these facts. So the third thing is it was proclaimed very early, coming out of the gates, right after the cross. And fourthly, their lives were transformed because of these facts to the point of being willing to die. You can't prove they all died as martyrs, but being willing to die. And then 5th and 6th, 2 skeptics, James, the brother of Jesus, and the Apostle Paul, both came to believe because they also had experiences that they thought were appearances of the risen Jesus. So those 6, you're almost not going to get any pushback. But what you're going to get is, show me how that gets you resurrection. I'll admit the data, but how do you get from there to resurrection?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Well, there's lots of books about Jesus Christ, most of them faith-based, and they can vary anything from Jesus as a shepherd to the Messiah to a teacher to a rabbi to leader, friend. I saw one book, Jesus is my homeboy. I don't know if that's accurate, but I want to ask you about the historical Jesus.
Sure.
What evidence can you share with us on the very existence of Jesus Christ, who he actually was and is?
Well, here's some of the categories of data. We have the New Testament canonical list of books. So generally, critics will not allow any apostles as authors of the 4 Gospels. It may be the case for these critics that the book is not inspired, but there's reliable information in the book. So you go for the reliable information because you have to be able to defend each point. And so they'll accept that when you find it. You talk about homeboy. Paul is the skeptic's homeboy. Because today, they love the Apostle Paul. Of the 13 books that bear his name, they'll let you use 7 of them. And they're the 7 that we would normally use because of their major works. Romans, 1st, 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, the first 4, Then you go to Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, and Philemon. If you cite those books, they might say, well, I think Paul's wrong there, but they won't tell you can't use that source. You can use Paul because they think, hey, look, the guy basically had a PhD in Old Testament. He studied under Gamaliel. He's a sharp thinker. My atheist friend Anthony Flew, I asked him once, why do you call Paul a philosopher, which he does, and he called Jesus a moral philosopher. Why do you call Paul a philosopher? And his answer was this quote. He goes, my golly, have you ever read the book of Romans? Well, sure, Tony, he's an atheist. His dad was an evangelical pastor. Yeah. But yeah, Romans, he goes, the man knows how to carry out an argument. So they respect Paul. That doesn't mean they accept everything as gospel truth, but he wouldn't lie and so on, so you can use the 7 books and a few other odd things. But there are sources outside the Gospels. There's Christian, non-canonical Christian sources. There's secular sources. I wrote a book years ago called Historical Jesus, and I used citations from 17 secular books, all non-Christian, that allow anything from a sentence to not more than a paragraph as a rule, but you can get over 50 facts about the life of Jesus and not touch the New Testament or a Christian source. There's archaeology, too, a few things from archaeology.
Oh, my goodness. Wow. So, Dr. Habermas, another thing you wrote about is miracles. Can you define miracles for us, and what are some of the miracles that you cover in your latest book?
Well, let me start with where the critics are. Usually you can start where they are, but then you have to explain why they're here. It's not enough to say they accept this. You have to say why they accept this. But almost all critical scholars, and I'll say how critical, well, atheist New Testament scholars will grant that Jesus was a healer and an exorcist. And you go, exorcist? You all believe in demons? No, we don't believe in demons. They don't exist. Then how could Jesus be an exorcist? Well, here's the point. Jesus did things that are recorded as exorcists in the New Testament. And whether it was epilepsy or some other kind of sickness, his amazing personality and his hands-on and cognitive theory, which we teach in counseling classes at Works, Jesus really healed them. So they might not have had a demon in them, but whatever did, they were healed, they got over it. And the healing miracles, we would say today that you can be healed by cognitive therapy by thinking correctly, which with the recent discovery about serotonin, and you can't be given, that's questionable for depression. Now we have to go to this cognitive thing. And so people are healed by cognitive method even today. So they think that's the kind of healing Jesus did. And I do have a chapter in the book early on. The book's about the resurrection, but I do have a background chapter on Jesus existed. I have another one on him being a miracle worker, because they concede that. By definition, well, here's the way David Hume, the famous skeptic, defines it. An event caused by God or an invisible agent. It's like an angel could do. But then Hume went on and said there are no such events. But my point is that's what a miracle would be. And then you go, yeah, but nothing fills that file folder. But they all know the definition. So it's a supernatural event caused by God or and the minute you say, yeah, we have some of those, you got to put the date up.
Yes.
Interesting, yeah,
Yes.
yeah. And of course, Dr. Habermas, big hockey guy, probably remembers the miracle on ice. Do you believe in miracles?
Yeah, what is it, 81, 82?
80,
Yeah.
probably, yeah. All right. Well, thank you. Let's pause for a quick commercial break. You're listening to In Pursuit of Excellence.
We'll return after this commercial break. You're listening to the In Pursuit of Excellence podcast. The Center for Teaching Excellence serves as a central location for professional development and the collection and dissemination of information relevant to the promotion of excellence in teaching and learning at Liberty University. We offer a robust number of services for online and residential faculty. To find out more about our services and support, visit www.liberty.edu/CTE. And now, part 2 of today's podcast.
Well, we're back talking about the resurrection of Christ with famed expert Dr. Gary Habermas. We chatted a little bit about miracles, and I was hoping you'd go a little more in depth about Jesus the healer. What can you share with us about actual healings?
Well, they think real healing took place, but all you need for real healing to take place is a person to say, once I was blind, but now I see. Now, they don't think, they generally say he doesn't heal the blind, but they could say I was sick, but I'm doing better now. But he could heal any number of people who are sick, and many, we have a lot of people today for whom anxiety and depression are the worst things in the world, and I bet you Jesus was an expert in those areas.
Yeah, do they give you any ground on raising a dead?
Well, one case from a Jesus Seminar scholar, and the Jesus Seminars are a really skeptical group. They reject over 90% of the red letter words of Jesus in the traditional Gospels. He said, I don't care what you believe about miracles, but I will tell you this. On historical grounds, it is virtually impossible to deny that Jesus was a healer and an exorcist. Then he asks the question, well, what about Lazarus? Could Jesus have raised Lazarus? And I'm thinking, as I'm reading this guy, he's going to say no. And he goes, I don't know. He said, we do not know the depth of this man's personality and what his benefits would be, so I'm just going to leave it neutrally and say everybody needs to make their own decision.
Wow. Yes, absolutely. So you wrote about the resurrection, of course, but there would be no resurrection without a death. Can you share a little about the death of Jesus?
Good question.
Yeah. With the death of Jesus, there's virtually no dissent among scholars. I'm talking about a person who has a terminal degree in a relevant area, which would be Old Testament, New Testament, philosophy, history, classics, archaeology.
Yeah.
And they're trained in those areas with terminal degrees. Scholars in that group will almost never question the death of Jesus. And that's because we have a lot of data. My research assistant, Ben Shaw, and a MD buddy of ours, who's an MD PhD, he's a neurologist, we co-authored an article for the Baylor University Medical Journal on Jesus' death by crucifixion. And we counted scholars, and this counting scholars doesn't prove what it was, but the majority view easily among the medical doctors. Now, they have dissenters among medical doctors, but the majority view is that Jesus died by asphyxiation. Because if you hung on the cross in a weight-bearing position where you're hanging down, the weight of your body constricts on the intercostal, pectoral, and deltoid muscles, what we work out on in a gym. And the problem is, like the asthmatic, you can inhale, but you're decreasingly unable to exhale. And in experiments, people have been crucified even in recent news. We see examples in the Middle East. We saw examples in Nazi Germany. And one researcher, a German medical doctor, had male volunteers, and all they did was tie him to 2x4s. Now, he didn't have anything to push his feet on, but these guys lost consciousness in a maximum of 11 or 12 minutes.
Wow.
So, but if you can push up, that's how you could live for a long time. So for starters, you've got, I think, probable asphyxiation. Now, not all doctors agree with that. But secondly, it says Jesus was stabbed in the side with a spear. Yeah. And they go, well, that's only the book of John. And we're not crazy about the book of John because it's the least respected of the Gospels from these atheist New Testament scholars. But we have a Roman source that says the centurion would allow the body of the crucifixion victim, when they took the victim down and the family wanted to bury the body, the centurion would allow them to take the body after a final death blow. And the word in Latin is percussus. And the word, I'm told from Latin experts, is a military term that means to be struck with an axe, a sword, or a spear. To me, that's decent confirmation of that one-liner in John. The best critique, and the ones that critics accept, was invented by a German, very, very liberal German scholar named David Strauss in the 19th century. He was so liberal, he was kicked out of the most liberal university in Germany for being too liberal. And he said, in his later life of Jesus, before he died, he said, the apparent death theory is a joke. And the reason it's a joke is not medical reasons, not because we had an EEG and an EKG. It's because anybody in a crucifixion condition, I don't care how you skirted death or whether you were in a coma or they took you down early or you were faking or you had paid off some Roman salt. I don't care. If you've been on the cross for hours, you're not going to be walking around 3 days later. And he said, so what's going to happen? You walk to where the disciples are. I don't know, half a mile? I don't know. You go to where the disciples are and you knock on the door, and what are you going to look like? He said, so Jesus, he didn't say all this, but this is what he assumed in this paragraph. It's a really heavy paragraph. And he goes, so Jesus says to the disciples, he's pale, he's bleeding, he's hunched over, and he goes, I told you I would rise again from the dead. And the saying is, he was alive, but he wasn't raised, because that's not how resurrection looks. And Peter would have shot out directions, go get the washcloth, Mary, go get some warm water, Andrew, go call the doctor. They would have known he was alive. They would not know he was raised. So the problem is saying he didn't die disproves the resurrection because he wasn't raised. And because of that critique, over 150 years ago, critics still give that reason today as why we know Jesus died on the cross, because it wouldn't work the opposite way around.
Absolutely. So one of the fascinating parts of the Bible is reading about the transformations of the disciples and the conversions of James and Paul. How do these acts, no pun intended, help substantiate your arguments?
Well, they're two of my six. In Mark 3, Mark 6, John 7, I thought they didn't accept those texts. Well, this fulfills one of their criteria, multiple attestation. You have more than one source. And in Mark 3, Jesus is mentally ill. The people in the town thought he was mentally ill. I think the word is similar to like schizophrenia. And they didn't want him there. You're embarrassing us to come to town. Well, the brothers seemed to agree with them, and they tried to take Jesus out of public view. Similarly in Mark 6, and then in John 7, you hear this comment, for as yet his brothers did not believe in him. In fact, in the text in John, it's almost like they're saying, hey, going up to Jerusalem, because it was pretty well known that if he went to Jerusalem, he's going to be in a lot of trouble, like maybe dying. And it's almost like they were encouraging him to go on up, like they were a little bit tired of the situation. Later, Jesus dies. He appears for 40 days, according to Scripture. And 40 days later, he ascends. 50 days later is Pentecost. And right after Pentecost is this experience, so-called in the upper room. There are about 120 people there, and at the end of the verse that tells you who all's there, the 12 apostles and it says, Mary and Mary were there, and the brothers of Jesus were present. So I'm arguing that probably, as far as we know, James wasn't at the cross. I'm guessing that his conversion apparently took place somewhere between the cross and the Ascension Day, some 50 or whatever. I don't know if the upper room was exactly the same day as the Ascension, but it had to be close. So a few weeks later, James is in the fold. And we actually have an extra biblical source. It's religious, but it's not canonical. It's in fragments. And one of the fragments is Jesus appears to James. It's pretty neat.
That's really amazing.
Yeah, it is amazing, but it was enough for him to be converted, and we know Paul's story. Those 30 AD, those sources from the 30s that I mentioned earlier, critics even say Paul probably knew several of those early reports, and it made him even angrier because the earliest reports use the name for Jesus that is used for Jehovah in the Old Testament. In the Greek Old Testament, it's the word for Jehovah that's applied to Jesus in the New Testament. That's pretty heavy.
Oh, wow. Absolutely. I wanted to ask one last question, if you have time, about the gospel accounts of the resurrection. What can you share about those accounts, and how do these support your argument for true and literal resurrection?
Okay, the gospel accounts are Matthew 28, Mark 16, however, footnote, Mark probably does not give any appearance accounts. He ends with the women leaving the tomb and being scared. Then Luke 24, John 20 and 21, and the first 11 verses of the book of Acts. I had to be real careful with the Gospels because the critics will take Paul before they take the Gospels. He's their darling. If you use those 7 books, they won't argue. So Paul preserves some of these 30-ish AD sources that, for example, the best known one is 1 Corinthians 15, 3 and following, that gives a list of 6 appearances. Everybody thinks that came from the 30s AD. And Paul, in fact, I call this a first century endnote, it being a doctoral dissertation. Paul says, verse 3, I delivered unto you that which I also received. What he's saying is, this is not my material. Now we would go, this is not my material, footnote. So Paul doesn't tell us where it came from, but it's pretty well agreed it came from the apostolic substrata in the 30s. Paul's citing the appearances to Jesus, and that's the list that has 3 groups and 3 individuals, and the groups are to the 12, to a group called all the apostles, broader, and a group to the appearance to the 500 at one time. So I started with Paul and argued for Paul because they won't even ask questions about Paul as a reason. Then when you go back to the Gospels, you have to use only texts that are credited. And there are gospel texts for which we have multiple reasons. So, for example, multiple attestation, the so-called, two heads are better than one theory. You want to use several sources for the same fact, like we had Mark and John for James not being a believer. We have Paul's own testimony that he's not a believer. So when he comes, that makes a difference. So I had to be real careful on the Gospels, but there are verses that they let stand in the Gospel. You just have to know where they are. And in their the resurrection account. So I like the Gospels fine, but I start with Paul because that's where everybody starts.
Very good. Wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, that's just great information.
Yes.
Dr. Habermas, is there anything else we should ask you about or anything else you'd like to cover?
So yeah, I love life and I love my family, and you can believe being raised, this has been the center of our conversations. In our family, if anybody talks data, they know we have to go to sources for the resurrection, because in the New Testament, the resurrection is absolutely the center. Paul said if Jesus wasn't raised, nothing else makes any difference. In fact, he even said Jesus died in vain. So since the resurrection is center, it works the other way too. If Jesus died on the cross, the gospel facts we're told to believe in: Jesus' deity, died on the cross, rose from the dead. Those are the three key. And I tell my students, if those three are true, Christianity's true, even if you can't defend another thing in 66 books. If those three are alone are true, Christianity follows. In fact, you want to get more specific. If the resurrection happened, Christianity follows. So it's a key course in our PhD program. It's a key subject that New Testament scholars go to all the time. We got to do it if we want to proclaim the same gospel message that the early apostles did. I guess that would be the main thing, because what that means is it's not just factually true. There are implications for today: how I counsel, how I would preach, how I would raise my family. What do we say about death and dying? Why does Paul say Christ has been raised from the dead, therefore we're not left to mourn in vain when our loved ones die, because we know they've been with Christ, as Paul says. So it has practical implications for virtually every area of practice and every area of theology in the New Testament.
Yeah, well, the book is called On the Resurrection, Evidences. We hope you pick it up as soon as it's available again. Thanks so much, Dr. Habermas, for being on today's podcast. We appreciate you. We appreciate all that you do, all that you've done, the scholarship of our Savior, Jesus Christ. And to our listeners, thanks for being with us today. Don't forget to like and subscribe to In Pursuit of Excellence. Let me close this in prayer if it's okay. Father, thank you for this opportunity to come together. We know where two or more are gathered, you're here with us. We ask your light shine down upon the people in this room, that they can continue to do your work to expand your kingdom. In your Son's holy name we pray, amen.
Thanks for listening to today's podcast. We hope you join us for our next episode of In Pursuit of Excellence, Teaching in Christian Higher Education. The Center for Teaching Excellence exists to empower, equip, and encourage faculty to advance Liberty University's mission of training champions for Christ. Our email address is ctepodcast@liberty.edu. Until next time, may God bless.